The man behind the camera, Big Ed Brown, a name that has echoed across millions of screens, evolved into memes, exploded on TikTok, and created endless debates in the reality TV universe. To many, he is nothing more than a viral character. The awkward man with the Mayo hair mask, the one-liner machine, the source of cringe compilations, and the guy who brought chaos into the life of Rose Vega. But what if I told you that behind the screams, laughter, sarcasm, and heated meme culture, there exists a man whose past carries scars deeper than most fans ever realized? What if I told you that beneath the comedic surface lies insecurity, a complicated emotional history, and a journey woven with heartbreak, mistakes, and a desperate attempt to be seen, to be loved, at any cost? Because this story is not really about reality TV. It's about how a man became a character, how a human turned into a spectacle, and how fans eventually uncovered the truth he tried so hard to hide. Before the internet memes, before TLC lights hit his face, before the world zoomed into his flaws, there was simply Ed. A young boy whose biggest dream wasn't fame, wasn't television, wasn't viral attention. His dream was small but powerful, to belong. He wanted acceptance. He wanted value. He wanted to matter. Big Ed's childhood wasn't dramatic in the cinematic sense. There were no explosions, no glamorous backdrops. He wasn't the loudest, the strongest, or the most attractive. He wasn't the boy everyone admired. He was the one who stood at the corner of the playground, smiling awkwardly, trying to crack a joke so people would turn and acknowledge him. That tiny shift of attention, that eye contact, was the first dopamine hit of his life. And he became addicted to it. From early on, Ed learned a dangerous emotional formula. If I make people laugh, they won't notice my flaws. Little did he know, this formula would one day take him to reality TV stardom, and eventually to public downfall. In school, he tried to find identity in humor. He became the funny guy because being funny was safer than being invisible. When life gave him insecurity, he masked it with jokes. When he feared rejection, he hid behind exaggerated expressions and goofy antics. Those behaviors didn't start in front of TLC cameras. The cameras simply amplified what was already there, a boy craving validation trapped inside a grown man's body. Years before the world met him, Ed lived a quiet life. He worked in interior design, held a regular job, lived in an ordinary neighborhood, and built a simple small-town routine. But inside him sat a silent storm, one painful truth he carried like an invisible weight. He wasn't enough. Not attractive enough. Not tall enough, not confident enough, not successful enough, and so he built walls painted with jokes, ego, and controlled vulnerability. Ed didn't let people see the raw version of him. He didn't trust the world with his truth. His emotions became a script, much before he ever joined a reality show. Then came love. And heartbreak. And a mistake that would haunt him for decades. Ed married young, and for a moment, life seemed stable. He had someone who chose him, someone who saw value in him beyond the jokes. But insecurity has a cruel voice, and sometimes it whispers louder when we finally have the love we always chased. Ed cheated. He betrayed the woman who believed in him. The marriage collapsed. His life shattered. The divorce did more than end a relationship. It broke an identity. Suddenly, Ed wasn't just a man who cheated. He was a man who destroyed the only real love he ever had. And that regret, that self-inflicted wound, became the seed of many behaviors viewers would later see on 90 Day Fiancé. Those who know him closely say Ed's life split into two phases, before the divorce and after the divorce. Before the betrayal, he was just a man trying to find himself. After it, he became a man terrified of losing love. Again. That fear manifested in control, possessiveness, oversharing, overcompensating, needing attention like oxygen. Fans saw these traits years later with Rose and later with Liz. But the origin was much older. It began in the moment he realized the consequences of losing someone he once took for granted. After the divorce, Ed's world shrunk. He poured all his emotional energy into the one person he believed he still had, his daughter, Tiffany. She became his anchor, his emotional safe space, the one relationship he couldn't afford to ruin. But even that bond would later crack under the weight of his choices. Ed tried to restart life quietly, building his career, living responsibly, making TikToks long before he was famous, craving the internet's small attention droplets. He didn't know it then, but this craving would one day pull him into the spotlight of millions. And then, TLC knocked. At first, it was just curiosity, a chance to try something new, a story of a middle-aged man finding love overseas. Harmless, right? But life works differently for men who carry unresolved insecurities. The show wasn't just a dating experience for Ed, it was a stage. A stage he never had in childhood. A stage he never had in his ordinary adult life. Finally, he could be seen. Finally, he could matter. And so entered Rose Vega, the moment the world met Big Ed. Not Ed Brown, the flawed human with past regrets, but Big Ed, the television character. The transformation was instant. The memes exploded. The critique began. Fans laughed, and Ed smiled even when it stung. Because attention, even negative attention, felt like a twisted victory. At least they were talking about him. At least he wasn't invisible, but fame has a microscope. And when you step into fame without healing your past, the past becomes the script. Every insecurity Ed once buried began to surface. His fear of abandonment turned into interrogation. His self-doubt turned into control. His longing for validation turned into cringe. And his unresolved guilt turned into emotional chaos. For a moment, Ed rode the wave. His name was everywhere. He wasn't just a reality show participant, he was the brand. Cameos, interviews, talk shows, memes, parody videos. Suddenly, the world couldn't stop talking about him. But what rises quickly often cracks violently, because fame brings attention, and attention brings investigation. Fans began digging, analyzing, dissecting. And what they found wasn't the goofy guy TLC packaged. They found inconsistencies. They found questionable behavior. They found patterns of manipulation. They found traces of emotional tactics. Tactics that didn't look funny when stripped of editing and laugh tracks. People began questioning, was Big Ed really this cute, awkward man? Or was he someone hiding behind humor to avoid accountability? Was his gimmick personality a coping mechanism, or a shield to manipulate sympathy? And once a question like that enters the public arena, it spreads like wildfire. The downfall didn't start suddenly. It started slowly, quietly, through whispers in online forums, TikTok commentary, and Reddit threads. Fans began piecing together his emotional history, the timeline of his daughter issues, the way he treated Rose, the red flags in his behavior with Liz, his sudden bursts of anger, his guilt triggers disguised as love. They didn't just watch him, they studied him, and they traced every pattern back to the one truth he could never escape. A man desperate to be loved will often love in destructive ways. This is where most stories end. But for Big Ed, this is where the real story begins. Because what fans would soon uncover, through old records, past interviews, former acquaintances, leaked screenshots, and emotional testimonies, would tear apart his television persona piece by piece. The internet didn't just watch Big Ed, the internet investigated Big Ed, and the discoveries would shock everyone. The Rose collapse and internet awakening, when Big Ed first stepped onto 90 Day Fiancé. Before the 90 days, viewers didn't know what was coming. He arrived not as a villain, not as a manipulator, not even as a romantic hero, but as a strange, curious character that no one truly understood. His look was unconventional, his demeanor awkward, his humor nervous, and his expectations unrealistically high. And then came Rose Vega, the young Filipina woman whose life would change forever. Not because she met the love of her life, but because she stood face to face with a man who carried more emotional baggage than the suitcases he dragged across Manila's airports. When Rose appeared on screen, She was simple, shy, hopeful. She wasn't wearing designer clothes or luxury makeup. She wasn't performing. She wasn't pretending. She was simply a woman looking for a chance at stability and love. A chance to build something better than what life had given her so far. But instead of understanding her reality, Ed carried his insecurity into the relationship. Viewers remember the scenes like they were yesterday. The toothbrush comment, the STD test ultimatum, the height remark, the constant suspicion, the subtle criticism, and the quiet emotional undertone that seemed to whisper, "Prove that you are good enough for me." But as millions saw, it wasn't Rose who needed to prove anything. It was Ed. He asked Rose to shave her legs when she never asked him to change himself. He questioned her intentions while hiding his own truth about not wanting more children. He demanded absolute honesty while filtering his own stories to look like the victim. And somewhere, buried under the amusing edits and comedic music, there was a darker psychological pattern emerging. I power through insecurity. Big Ed's insecurity didn't just show. It dictated the tone of the relationship. Fans began noticing subtle things. His discomfort with being challenged, his tendency to sugarcoat, control as concern, his habit of using humor to avoid real responsibility, his disappointment turning into passive-aggressive comments, his need to be adored instead of understood. What started as awkward entertainment slowly began to feel like manipulation wrapped in insecurity. And then came the moment that changed everything, the shower scene. The internet didn't see romance. It saw discomfort, imbalance, power dynamic, and embarrassment. This wasn't a love story. This was a psychological performance, a public humiliation disguised as cultural misunderstanding. The memes were funny, until they weren't. Because for the first time, viewers began asking a question TLC never did. Why is this man treating her like this? And slowly, the comedic tone faded. The internet began digging. People revisited every scene. Clips went viral not as jokes, but as evidence. Was Big Ed insecure? Or emotionally manipulative? Was he childish? Or controlling? Was he socially awkward? Or deliberately belittling? Then Rose, empowered by global support, spoke. Her videos, raw and unfiltered, began exposing details TLC never released. She wasn't the naive girl Ed portrayed her as. She wasn't desperate. She wasn't using him. She simply wanted basic respect, and Ed couldn't give it. When Rose walked away, it wasn't just a breakup. It was a powerful cultural moment. A young single mother from a developing country stood up against a much older, more privileged man on international TV, and won her dignity back. And at that moment, fans stopped laughing. They started investigating. Reddit threads turned into psychological case studies. YouTube breakdowns analyzed his language patterns. TikTok creators dissected scenes frame by frame, every eye roll, every guilt tactic, every emotional nudge disguised as love. People weren't judging his neck or his hair or his walk anymore. They were judging his intent, and intent leaves a fingerprint. Suddenly, screenshots surfaced. Old posts reemerged. Claims appeared from people who knew him in real life. Stories painted a pattern, a man who sought love but didn't know how to give it. A man who wanted loyalty but didn't offer emotional safety. A man who demanded trust but didn't trust others. Someone who wasn't evil, but wasn't innocent either. Someone broken, unhealed, unfinished, trying to script romance like a TV episode, not realizing real life doesn't follow TLC editing. But just when the world assumed Ed would disappear into meme history, he did the most unexpected thing. He came back, into a new relationship, into another emotional storm, into another televised cycle of love, chaos, control, apology, breakup, reunion, and heartbreak. Enter Liz Woods, the woman who would expose a new layer of Big Ed's emotional complexity. Liz didn't arrive from a distant country. She didn't have a cultural barrier. She wasn't financially vulnerable. She was American, independent, working, raising a child, and standing on her own feet. And yet, she fell for him. Not because she was weak, not because she didn't see the flaws, but because trauma bonds don't choose logic. Emotional vulnerability attracts emotional vulnerability. Their story was different than Rose's, less about culture, more about psychology. Less about environment, more about emotional cycles. Viewers watched their relationship unfold like a slow-building psychological thriller. Arguments broke out. Breakups happened. Not once, not twice, but endlessly. Reconciliation after reconciliation. Tears followed by promises. Promotions to fiancé followed by accusations. It was messy. It was raw. It was real, in all the wrong ways. Fans weren't laughing anymore. They were concerned. For Liz, for Ed, for the emotional health of everyone involved. And then, the internet dug again, this time deeper, sharper, colder. This wasn't just about drama anymore. This was about patterns that pointed toward emotional conditioning and insecurity-driven control. This was about red flags, not as isolated events but as a timeline. People uncovered old messages. Witnesses came forward publicly. Clips resurfaced with context. Psychologists analyzed their dynamics online, and one painful realization emerged. Big Ed wasn't just a character. He was a person with deeply unresolved wounds capable of damaging others emotionally while trying to protect himself from pain. The public opinion shifted permanently. He became less of a meme, and more of a case study of insecurity in relationships. The question was no longer, why is he like this? The question became, how many people did this version of him hurt before cameras started rolling? And that question opened the door to the real hidden past fans were about to uncover. Because behind every televised storyline, there are unfilmed stories, private memories, private conflicts, private victims, private regrets, that reality TV contracts never disclose. But the internet always finds, and it found Ed's. The past wasn't just messy, it was layered, complicated, and emotionally heavy. And once fans pulled that first thread, the entire facade began to unravel. Liz, the breaking point and cracks in the illusion. When Big Ed entered a relationship with Liz Woods, the world expected a redemption arc. People assumed he learned from Rose. They believed humility would replace ego. Patience would replace control. Growth would replace insecurity. Reality television has trained audiences to crave transformation. A hero emerging from ashes, wiser, kinder, renewed, but instead of rebirth, viewers witnessed déjà vu. The first sign was subtle, a tone, a look, a shift in posture. The kind of micro-changes you notice only when you've seen someone hurt before. Liz wasn't a foreigner. She wasn't inexperienced. She wasn't unfamiliar with Western dating culture. Yet, slowly she began shrinking emotionally. The unmistakable sign of someone constantly bracing for emotional turbulence. At first, Ed presented himself as the affectionate, quirky, trying his best partner. He praised Liz in confessionals. He called her special. He labeled their relationship as unexpected magic. And for a moment, viewers almost believed that this time would be different. But emotional patterns don't change through wishful thinking. They repeat until healed. Soon the breakups began. Once, twice, then again, and again, and again, until breakup announcements became less shocking than reconciliations. What made their story painful wasn't the drama. It was the emotional rhythm, the rise, the fall, the apology, the reunion. Over and over, the cycle of trauma bonding disguised as love. Anyone who has ever been in a psychologically imbalanced relationship knows this pattern. One partner pulls away to regain power. The other chases to restore connection. Reunion feels euphoric, not because love is blooming, but because fear momentarily numbs, and fear, not love, becomes the glue. The internet began documenting everything. Timeline charts, TikTok edits showing contradiction clips, Twitter threads analyzing every argument, Reddit essays comparing his behavior with clinical emotional cycles. Every fight had a pattern. Ed withdrawing emotionally to assert control, then demanding loyalty once Liz crumbled under pressure. Every reconciliation had a script: grand gestures, emotional promises, public displays framed as proof of change. Yet the cracks widened. There were leaked audio clips, voice messages where anger spilled through cracks in the mask. There were claims from witnesses who saw arguments unfold in real life. There were screenshots fans dissected line by line, not to mock him, but to understand whether his behavior crossed into emotional harm. Viewers no longer saw awkward insecurity. They saw weaponized insecurity, using self-pity as leverage, guilt as a leash, affection as a reward, silence as punishment. And somewhere in the middle of this storm was Liz, a woman being pulled in so many emotional directions that even her voice began trembling differently over time. People noticed how she defended him, how she justified behavior, how she apologized even when she hadn't done anything wrong, how she believed in versions of him he couldn't consistently live up to. It wasn't stupidity. It was hope. The most dangerous kind. The hope that someone you love will one day become the version of themselves you dream about. And it was in that vulnerability that the audience saw Liz not as a cast member, but as a real woman with real emotions, slowly drowning inside a relationship she believed she could fix. Meanwhile, Ed didn't realize the world wasn't laughing with him anymore. They weren't entertained. They were concerned. He thought memes made him relevant. But sympathy was shifting. The narrative wasn't funny man with no neck anymore. It was man who keeps sabotaging the women in his life. Then came the moment viewers will never forget. Not a big fight. Not a viral meme, but something quieter, heavier, the silence of his daughter. Tiffany, for years, she was his emotional backbone. He often spoke about her as the center of his world. She witnessed his heartbreak, his divorce, his loneliness. She supported him, guided him, believed in him. But Liz changed the equation. Tiffany wasn't against Liz. She was against watching her father repeat cycles that caused pain. Cycles she likely saw long before cameras existed. She pulled back, not out of hatred but out of heartbreak. Watching someone you love self-destruct isn't betrayal, it's grief. Fans started noticing Tiffany's absence. The daughter who once appeared proudly now grew distant. Her silence spoke louder than any interview could, because silence from the person who knows you best is never neutral. It's a verdict, and while Tiffany stepped back emotionally, Ed stepped further into the spotlight, trying to perform stability while drowning in unresolved wounds. This was the stage where fan detectives went full force. Every action examined, every post time-stamped, every inconsistency noted. People found old acquaintances sharing stories of Ed's emotional behavior long before TLC, former colleagues mentioning his fragile ego, personal contacts describing how quickly admiration turned into resentment if attention wasn't reciprocated. Patterns emerged not across months, but decades. His past wasn't a mystery anymore. It was a map leading back to insecurity, needing love but fearing vulnerability, wanting control more than closeness, confusing loyalty with obedience, and mistaking emotional panic for passion. And while the internet unraveled the psychology, Liz unraveled emotionally. Her weight fluctuated, her eyes changed, her voice shifted. Moments of happiness existed, yes, because trauma bonds aren't only pain. They are intoxicating highs followed by crushing lows, but viewers could see it. The exhaustion, the hesitation, the cautious tone of a woman learning to tiptoe through emotional minefields. And just when fans thought things couldn't get more complicated, Ed proposed, publicly, grandly, emotionally charged, redemption style, fairy tale packaged. Not because the relationship had achieved harmony, but because dramatic gestures feel like progress when you're afraid of losing someone. For a moment, hearts softened. People wanted to believe change was real, that love had finally beaten insecurity. But reality doesn't bend to romantic speeches. Love isn't transformation, responsibility is. Healing isn't saying, I'll change. It's changing when no one is watching. And as the months unfolded, reality reasserted itself. The cycles didn't break. They intensified. Fans who once laughed now watched with sinking hearts. They didn't see a villain. They saw a wounded man who became his own worst antagonist and dragged others into the storm he carried. This wasn't entertainment anymore. It was emotional erosion captured in HD, and behind closed doors, truth was brewing. Private conflicts, private messages, private heartbreaks the cameras didn't show but the internet eventually exposed, because Big Ed thought he could script his story. But trauma doesn't follow scripts, and the truth always finds light, especially in the digital age. The story wasn't finished. The mask hadn't fully fallen, but fans could feel it. Something big was coming, a breaking point, a final collapse, the end of the illusion, and when it arrived, it wouldn't just change public perception. It would permanently alter how Big Ed's name echoed across reality TV history. The fall, the backlash and the search for redemption. When the curtain finally began to fall on Big Ed's televised journey, the cracks that fans had whispered about for years split wide open. The man who once made millions laugh was now the subject of serious conversation. Not memes, not jokes, but questions. Questions like, how much of what we saw was real? How much of it was edited? And how much was truth staring us in the face the whole time? For the first time, the audience that made him famous began pulling away. They weren't entertained anymore. They were analyzing. They weren't sharing clips for humor. They were sharing them as cautionary tales. And then the final collapse arrived, the end of Ed and Liz. It didn't happen in one explosive episode. It happened slowly, like a house sinking into its own foundation. Every fight chipped away at the illusion of progress. Every reconciliation sounded rehearsed. Every public appearance looked like two people trying to convince the world, and themselves, that everything was fine. But love built on fear always falls. The breakup was messy. Screenshots appeared online, text exchanges full of confusion and pain, voice notes laced with tension, accusations on social media that both deleted and reposted within hours. The internet pounced. Analysts, psychologists, and even other TLC cast members began weighing in. This wasn't Big Ed the reality star anymore. This was a man whose private implosion had become public content. Liz finally reached her emotional limit. In interviews, she hinted at exhaustion, the kind that comes when you love someone so much you start losing yourself. She spoke about the on and off cycle, the pressure, the constant tension between being loved and being blamed. Her words weren't bitter. They were broken, and for the first time in years, the sympathy shifted completely away from Ed. People weren't laughing. They were angry. Angry that TLC kept enabling the cycle for ratings. Angry that production turned real trauma into good television. Angry that a pattern so visible had gone unchecked for so long. The backlash was brutal. Former fans began revisiting his early episodes, rewriting the narrative. What once looked like awkward romance now looked like gaslighting. What once seemed like insecurity now looked like manipulation. What once felt like humor now felt like humiliation. Reddit and TikTok became archives of evidence. Fans compiled chronological lists of every red flag. YouTube commentators dissected every emotional tactic. Body language experts broke down his gestures frame by frame, explaining how defensive humor and over-explaining often mask guilt and control. And then, the past resurfaced again. Old acquaintances, colleagues, even distant relatives began sharing small fragments of their experiences with Ed. Nothing extreme, but enough to sketch a pattern. Insecurity turning into dominance, emotional volatility masked as passion, victimhood used as justification. The collective picture wasn't of a monster. It was of a wounded man who never learned to heal, and hurt others in the process. When you build your identity around being misunderstood, every criticism feels like persecution. And that's exactly how Ed responded. Instead of reflection, he defended. Instead of apology, he deflected. Instead of silence, he doubled down on social media performances, posting motivational captions, self-deprecating jokes, and exaggerated positivity. But fans could see the fatigue behind the filters. The smile didn't reach his eyes anymore. The jokes felt hollow. Fame had turned from validation into punishment. Behind the scenes, his relationship with his daughter Tiffany remained strained. She no longer appeared publicly with him, and her silence continued to speak volumes. To many viewers, that became the saddest part of all. That a man who once said his daughter was his world had lost her trust chasing strangers' approval. By 2025, Big Ed wasn't just a TLC name, it was a symbol. To some, he symbolized how insecurity can corrode love. To others, he represented how reality TV profits from emotional dysfunction. Documentaries, podcast discussions, and academic articles began referencing him as a cultural case study in parasocial empathy and public redemption. But could there ever really be redemption for Big Ed? That became the final debate. Some argued yes, that awareness is the first step, that people can evolve if they truly confront themselves. They pointed to moments where Ed admitted mistakes, where he seemed genuinely remorseful. Others said no. That apology without transformation is manipulation with better lighting. Yet somewhere in that gray area between accountability and forgiveness, Big Ed began fading from the headlines. The memes slowed. The laughter stopped. The man who once defined cringe TV quietly retreated into semi-obscurity. But the silence was not peace. It was consequence. For years, Ed tried to script his own redemption story, but healing isn't produced. It's earned. The very platform that gave him visibility also became the mirror that forced him to face the truth he'd spent decades running from. You cannot outrun your reflection. In one quiet interview clip, perhaps his most honest moment, he said, "I just wanted to be loved. That's all I ever wanted." And that line, stripped of ego, stripped of meme culture, was the truest thing he ever said. Because underneath every mistake, every controlling impulse, every viral outburst lived a simple, wounded desire for love and belonging. But desire without self-awareness becomes destruction. That's the tragedy of Big Ed Brown. A man who mistook attention for affection, validation for value, and control for connection. The internet didn't destroy him. It just showed him to himself. And perhaps that's the greatest lesson his story leaves behind. That fame amplifies what you refuse to face. That healing ignored becomes performance repeated. That real love demands self-respect before affection. In the end, there's no villain here, just a man caught between who he was and who he pretended to be, and a global audience learning to tell the difference. The takeaway for viewers: if there's one thing this saga teaches, it's that we, the audience, often mistake entertainment for empathy. We cheer, we joke, we meme. But behind those viral clips are real people carrying real pain. Big Ed Brown became a mirror not only for insecurity, but for our culture's addiction to spectacle. We laughed at him because it was easier than confronting how much of him exists in all of us. The fear of rejection, the hunger for validation, the desperate attempt to control what we can't. Understand, the real hidden past of Big Ed isn't just his personal history, it's the collective blindness of a society that turns unhealed trauma into primetime humor. So as the camera fades, and the echo of his name slowly dissolves into TV history, maybe the final line belongs not to him, but to us, the viewers. Be careful what stories you laugh at. Because behind every punchline is a person who stopped knowing where the joke ends.